If you're anything close to my age, you probably noticed that there has been a shift in the impressions of culture of Christianity and the expressions of Christianity and faith and culture. Aaron Renn here is a guy who has a book that everybody's talking about. It's called Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. First Liberty has a little book club that gets together over lunch, and we just finished doing your book. We just went through it as part of the book club, so we had quite a few conversations, and some of these questions are from my colleagues who just wanted to hear it. But first, before we begin, for those who've not had opportunity to read the book, summarize for me, if you will, the three phases that you've seen over the last 60, 70 years in America.
Yeah, well, the core of the book is around a model of understanding the decline of Christianity in America. So, unlike Europe, we never had a state church. But for most of our history, we had a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism and kind of later a generic Judeo-Christianity as our default national religion.
Yeah.
So in the 50s, half of all adults attended church every Sunday. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools.
I learned the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm in first grade. That was because it was assumed every good student needs to know at least that.
Right, yeah. So I think it was 1962 that the court invalidated prayer in school. So again, we were adding "In God We Trust" to our money, under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. That was the kind of country we lived in. In the 60s, that began to become unraveled. The status of Christianity began to go into decline in America. And I divide the period of decline from, say, 1964 to the present into three phases or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. In the positive world, Christianity's in decline, church attendance is down. I'm not saying it's all positive in that sense, yet Christianity is still basically viewed positively by society. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society, and the Christian moral system is the default moral system of America.
And if you're running for political office, people want to know where you go to church.
Exactly. I mean, I'm told that even sometimes into this positive world era, this whether you were a member of a church counted as to whether you get a loan from a bank. Are you the kind of person that would pay the loan? You're a member of a church.
Yeah.
Of course, now we don't do that, but that was sort of like before all these fancy credit scores and things. Those are the kinds of things that would happen.
Yeah.
We want to vote for office, we want to hire them, that sort of thing. 1994, we had a tipping point and entered the neutral world, which lasted from 1994 to 2014. In the neutral world, Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. So we might meet. I'd say I'm a Christian. You'd say, great, I'm a vegan. Let's talk. And Christian morality had a certain residual hold in society.
Yeah.
Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and entered the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically, maybe a better way to put it. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian doesn't help you get a job in the elite domains of society. Christian morality, in respects, is now expressly repudiated and in some ways is viewed as a new threat to the new public moral order. And this shift to a negative world has been very dislocating to American Christians, particularly evangelicals, who are used to thinking of themselves as, in the name of the old organization, a moral majority.
Right.
That's certainly not the case anymore.
And I can hear the thoughts in people's heads as they're hearing you describe that. You don't get too picky about the dates. If people want to fuss about the dates, they can slide one way or the other, but you're trying to pick out windows of time, eras of time where you've seen this. And it also, I would think, would have a geographical difference as well. Texas is going to be lagging behind California, for example, right?
Sure, there's a saying in the technology industry, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. I do think there is a sense in which, yes, there are areas where there's more intense negativity towards Christianity. And then there's areas like, I grew up in rural southern Indiana.
Yeah.
It's still a positive world in a sense. It's good to go to church. People like you there. I live in suburban Indianapolis now. Going to church is like normal in a sense. However, I want to caveat that to one extent. Even in rural southern Indiana, where I'm at, all of these ideologies are in your public schools.
Yep.
They're in your libraries.
They are.
The young people, the teenagers, have all been catechized by TikTok. And pastor from New York, John Tyson, really helped me understand something that I hadn't quite put my finger on, which is that the delta in culture between New York City and rural southern Indiana is smaller than it's ever been. It used to be, you would have something like the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969, and then 40, 50 years later, rural Iowa is now having a pride parade. But it took a long time to, go from New York City or San Francisco or LA or one of these culture capitals all the way out to the rest of America. Now, because of social media, it's instant. So whereas there's, Tyson says, look, the difference between a 50-year-old in New York City and a 50-year-old in Atlanta, there's still a pretty big difference in terms of a lot of things. The difference between a 15-year-old in New York and a 15-year-old in Atlanta is not nearly so big because everybody is on the same social media platforms.
Yeah, very much. And don't take this the wrong way, but I'm reading through your book and I'm thinking, I don't really need to read this because I lived it
Right.
and was involved in the culture wars that went along. But then I realized in the room with us, with the book club, were some of my younger coworkers. And the only world they know really that they think is the world as it's always been is the negative world. They don't have any perception that it wasn't that many years ago that things were so incredibly different in our culture. How do we reach them with that message and help them understand that the way it is isn't how it has to be?
Well, two things. First, one reason my book resonated so much with people is not that it gave groundbreaking information, but that it created a language and a model for people to talk about what they had already seen, what they'd already sensed.
And I want to affirm that because when I read the book, that's exactly what I came away with is what you're saying right now.
It's not like people hadn't seen this already. This is why it resonated. Like, wow, this helps me understand what I was already seeing out there in the world. Now, when it comes to Gen Z, the phenomenon that you described is why I'm so optimistic, in a sense, about Gen Z. So I studied urban policy previously when I was at the Manhattan Institute, and a lot of my work was on Rust Belt cities in the Midwest. And so you think about, for example, one of these industrial cities, Cleveland or Pittsburgh, and the steel mills started closing, the auto plants started closing, and there was white flight, and the city started to go down the tubes, and the infrastructure got decayed. And the department store where your mom took you, if you're a girl, took you when you were a little kid to go get tea and white gloves, it's gone. And so with baby boomers and even Generation X, the relationship to the city was one of decline. Cities are going down the tubes. There's this sense of loss that they were dealing with. By the time the millennials came along, especially in the 2000s, they had never known cities that hadn't already been collapsed. To them, they came into the world essentially after cities had already bottomed out. Rudy Giuliani, elected mayor in New York, cities started to come back. Mm-hmm. And all they ever knew was kind of cities growing again. So their relationship to the city was completely different. To them, it's like, wow, I'm part of this amazing escalator. It's happening. I'm part of this great movement because they never experienced the decline. And I think there's something similar with Gen Z Christianity. Boomers, Gen X, even millennials living through 60 years of decline. It's kind of an experience of loss, a narrative of loss. Oh, what we lost in the 1980s. Well, a Gen Z person comes in like, I never lived through any boom economies.
Yeah.
I never lived through any Christian America. So they're not burdened with this sense of loss. And so I think they can look at it and say, well, we're kind of already at the bottom. Maybe we can come back up. And so you do see some indications like Gen Z, more of them are going to church.
We keep seeing numbers that young men are returning to church in bigger numbers. And Joe Rogan they say he might be going to church. I don't know, exactly. But something's happening.
But here's you also see these young people. There's a young guy. He goes by the name Redeemed Zoomer online.
Okay.
And his whole thing is what he calls Operation Reconquista. And he's like, we're going to take over the mainline denominations for Orthodox Christianity. Don't go split off into some new thing.
That's interesting.
The mainline denominations are getting old. us young people are going to come here and we're going to inherit the kingdom when all these guys die off. That's an oversimplification. But this idea that like, we're going to go reclaim territory, or you'll read about the technology scene in El Segundo, California, the Gundo, they call it. Mm-hmm. It's all these young Gen Z people, you know, and younger millennials that all want to start the hard defense tech startups. Like, hey, we're going to create the new drone armies of the future. Very pro-patriotic, pro-Jesus. A millennial youth pastor told me, he's like, you know, campus minister, he's like, you know, when my generation of Christians was on campus, you know, we would never have, you know, worn like a Jesus t-shirt. Like, how we wouldn't have done. Like these young people, you know, these young Gen Z people on campus, they're like out and proud Christians. And so there's like a different, you know, everybody talks about how bad things are for Gen Z, and there's a lot of bad stuff in Gen Z, don't get me wrong. But the best Gen Z might be the best we've ever had. And the mere fact that they're not psychologically burdened by 50-something years of culture war and Christianity decline may actually be an asset to them.
And that may help explain as well the revivals that we're seeing happen on campuses around the country that seem to be student-driven, student-led. Suddenly have thousands of kids being baptized in a lake on their campus. Where did that come from? Those of us who've lived through all this are wondering, where is it coming from?
Right. And again, I don't want to make any predictions that we're going to see this massive wave of re-Christianization across the country. I think cultural renewal is possible, but it's a very long-term process. You know, we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of here overnight. But I do think, you know, Gen Z, you know, I feel very good about Gen Z in some respects.
Yeah. The latter part of your book, the last third pretty much, I don't know if it's exactly that, but basically you talk about strategies for Christians to maintain in this negative world. You're not recommending we become monks. Rod Dreher got accused of that along the way, but and not incorrectly. I mean, his book kind of went a different direction, but a lot of people say we don't want to live in monasteries and separate ourselves from society. How do we exist in a negative world, exist in a negative society, and maintain the beliefs that we hold near and dear to our hearts that are part of what make us who we are?
Yeah. I mean, I say that, you know, the first third of the book is sort of cultural diagnostics, and then the last 3/4 of it are essentially ideas for the future across 3 dimensions. What do we do as kind of individuals and families? What do we do as churches and Christian organizations? And then how should we think about mission in the world? And I don't have like, here's what you need to do. These are just ideas to get you thinking. But I do think we have to recognizing that, particularly for Protestants, you know, American Protestants and evangelicals, this was a Protestant country. And so the mainstream institutions of society sort of embodied the values of Protestantism and sort of reinforced them. Whereas even Catholics, you know, coming to America, you know, a lot of the Catholics didn't necessarily like Bible reading in public schools because it was like the Protestants' Bible. Mm-hmm. And so they said, well, we better create our own school system. And we better create our own fraternal organizations. And we better create, you know, our own universities. They created in the early 20th century an entire ecosystem to sustain and maintain Catholic life in this very Protestant country. You know, there's a lot of these immigrants who came here. And even as they went into the mainstream of society, you know, in the post-war era, they still held on to much of that. Whereas I think evangelicals had relied much more on the mainstream institutions, right? The Protestant universities really, in the day, were like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale.
Yeah, they were.
There certainly aren't that anymore. And so now we have to see that there does have to be some parallel infrastructure built, not in the sense of hiding out, but just to transmit and sustain your values in community life. And of course, that's happening in education with classical Christian schools, with homeschooling. It's like, well, we can't rely on the schools to teach the good moral values that we thought they were supposed to teach, but like now they're doing different, so we want to have different. So I think that's happening across a number of dimensions. Yeah. I also think there's a lot of, I think there needs to be a rethinking of politics in the political engagement. Not that we would disengage from politics in a sense. I think we have to stay very active in politics, but we're going to have to be much more prudent in what we push for in light of, you know, the cultural realities in America. the reality is, if much of what American Christians hold like sacred in terms of morality is unpopular.
Yeah.
And you're not going to be able to legislate that in a counter-majoritarian manner, at least not in any durable way.
But you can live it.
You can live it, but you can also focus on, okay, what's popular? I think great laws around age verification to access porn. Why? Because everybody in America, you don't have to be religious to say, I don't want my 12-year-old downloading hardcore porn on his phone. And so I think areas where there's actually, Matthew Iglesias, the Democratic pundit, he's got this idea he calls popularism. I don't know if that's he coined that, but it's like, Democrats need to do things that are popular, not things that are unpopular. And these hard left ideas that they promoted were very unpopular. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a sense of that here. And I think, Ron DeSantis in Florida did some of that. It's like, hey, you know what? Sexualizing kindergarten is not popular. Maybe we shouldn't have sexual content in kindergarten.
All this ends when the moms get mad.
Yeah, and
That's
so
what
it's
I've been
like,
saying for years.
I think the reality is, like, especially when it comes to kids, there's still a lot of sensitivity there.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, let's do things that are popular, and then, we'll see if we can make some other things popular at a future date. But the reality is, we have to be somewhat realistic about what's possible politically. Whereas I think the church, as the church, its role is to, proclaim the whole counsel of God and within its community and all that. But in the political world, the political world is prudence and wisdom.
Another suggestion you had in the book, which made me, I thought about it a lot after I read this section. You talked about starting a business and running it on Christian principles so that Christians in the community have a place they can work. It seems so simple, but it just hadn't registered with me before.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there's always this point in the past, like back in the culture war era, like when I was in high school, this idea that, like, okay, we have to have parallel culture. Smash your AC/DC cassettes and buy the contemporary Christian music. Yeah. Because we don't like we don't like rock and roll music, or we don't like that. But there was always a sense that, like, most of the other institutions of society are just sort of, neutral. You don't have to worry that, like, you're not going to be able to get a hotel room because you're Christian. Well, you're still not going to have to worry about getting a hotel room. But now I think it's like, oh, wait a minute here. More and more of institutional life in America embodies sort of principles far outside of the core function of the institution. So companies today, the ESG, DEI stuff, that's really peripheral to the core business of, say, selling beer. If you're Anheuser-Busch or whomever, no, we're going to be doing that. And so I think there also needs to be more focus on kind of controlling your own economic destiny as well, and that means more entrepreneurship and not just mom and pop small business. I'm talking about ambitious, like medium-sized businesses being kind of the sweet spot, that 10 million to $1 billion in revenue. Yeah. Places that generate a lot of profits, places that employ like management staff. And I give some examples in the book, but I think that can be it's going to be a big source of wealth to sustain your community and build up your ministries as well.
I can strongly recommend the book. It's called Life in the Negative World by Aaron Renn. Aaron, thank you so much for making time for us. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.